Many of us wonder about our place in the long human story, where we came from and how we became who we are. This curiosity about our ancestors' inner lives drives archaeological research today. We'll explore what the evidence actually reveals about early human consciousness. How did they perceive their world, and when did they begin to reflect on concepts like mortality and time? We tend to assume that burying the dead indicates a belief in an afterlife, but the archaeological record reveals a more gradual development of this practice. Some of the earliest known intentional burials come from sites like Shanidar Cave and Kafze, where Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens carefully placed bodies in prepared pits tens of thousands of years ago. These graves sometimes included stone tools or animal bones, which initially appear to signal ritual behaviour. However, interpretation is not straightforward. The presence of objects alongside the deceased could simply reflect practical considerations rather than spiritual beliefs. Some researchers propose that these items were personal possessions buried with the body, or that the act of digging a grave served hygienic purposes, protecting the living from scavengers or disease. The posture of the bodies, often flexed or fetal, might indicate nothing more than the most efficient way to place a body in a small pit. When we compare these early burials with those from the Upper Paleolithic period, the difference becomes more apparent. Later graves feature ochre pigments scattered over the body, elaborate beadwork, carved figurines, and clear grave goods that suggest symbolic offerings. This contrast indicates that the earliest burial practices may have expressed emotional responses to loss rather than complex cosmological concepts. Grief, not doctrine, likely motivated these first acts of interment. This emotional engagement with death represents a critical step in cognitive development. The capacity to mourn demonstrates an awareness of personal loss and social bonds, creating a foundation upon which abstract ideas about existence could later develop. These early graves mark the beginning of humanity's long relationship with mortality, a relationship that would eventually encompass ritual, belief, and philosophy. The evidence suggests that we first learn to feel death before we learn to explain it. This emerging emotional depth would soon find expression through another medium entirely, the first deliberate marks made by human hands. Some of the earliest marks made by human hands appear almost casual. A zigzag pattern incised on a freshwater shell in Java, or geometric cross-hatching on a piece of red ochre in South Africa. These artefacts from Trinil and Blombos Cave date back tens of thousands of years and present archaeologists with a persistent question. Are these purposeful symbols, or simply the result of idle activity, like doodling absent-mindedly? The divide in interpretation reflects a deeper debate about early cognition. If these marks were intentional symbols, they would represent one of the first signs of abstract thought, the ability to let a shape or pattern stand for something else entirely. This is not art in the expressive sense we understand today, but rather a cognitive breakthrough, the capacity to assign and recognize meaning beyond literal utility. Without written language to clarify intention, these scratches offer our only direct evidence for whether early humans had begun to use representation. Their significance lies not in aesthetic value, but in what they imply about the mind that made them. The repetition of certain patterns, like parallel lines or diamond shapes, across different artifacts, and sometimes across vast distances, suggests these forms may have held shared meaning. They hint at a proto-symbolic system, a kind of visual vocabulary that was learned and repeated. This flicker of symbolic thought provided the essential foundation for all that followed. The ability to encode meaning externally, to make a mark that carries an idea, was a revolutionary step. It allowed knowledge and concepts to exist outside an individual's memory, to be shared, refined, and transmitted. These early engravings are the cognitive precursors to the elaborate narratives painted on cave walls millennia later. This nascent skill in visual representation would have influenced how these early people conceptualized their environment and their actions within it. The same mental capacity that allowed for marking a shell with a pattern could also enable more complex planning and communication, directly affecting practical strategies like hunting, which required foresight and coordination. The mind that could make a symbol was a mind ready to engage with the world in profoundly new ways. While we often imagine early hunting as a test of brute strength, evidence suggests some groups employed a strategy that relied far more on mental endurance than physical power. Persistence hunting involves tracking an animal over long distances, often in high heat, until the prey collapses from exhaustion. This method has been documented among modern hunter-gatherer societies and likely has deep roots in our evolutionary past. What makes this approach particularly significant is its cognitive demands. The hunter must maintain pursuit long after the animal has vanished from sight, relying on tracks, broken vegetation, and knowledge of animal behaviour to predict its path. This requires not just physical stamina, but a sophisticated mental model of the landscape and the prey's likely movements. The hunter needs to understand the animal's vulnerabilities, knowing which terrain favours pursuit, how temperature affects different species, and when the animal might seek water or shelter. This form of hunting demonstrates a capacity for extended forecasting and environmental modelling. The hunter must think hours or even a full day ahead, anticipating the animal's reactions to various pressures. There's also an element of empathy involved, the ability to mentally simulate the animal's experience of fatigue, fear, and desperation. This represents a form of abstract reasoning applied to an immediate physical challenge. The cognitive skills developed through persistence hunting would have served as foundation for more complex planning. The ability to project outcomes across extended timeframes and space would prove essential for seasonal migration patterns, resource management, and eventually multi-generational projects. This tangible demonstration of foresight in the physical world makes the emergence of conceptual foresight, such as planning rituals or imagining future seasons, more plausible. The mind that could outthink its prey across miles of wilderness was developing the capacity to navigate much more abstract territories of thought. The transition to the Upper Paleolithic period marks a distinct shift in the archaeological record, where evidence for symbolic behaviour becomes both abundant and unambiguous. Around 50,000 years ago, we begin to find sophisticated artefacts and practices that suggest a new level of cognitive complexity. This change is visible across multiple domains of early human activity, from artistic expression to technological innovation. Cave paintings at sites like Chauvet and Lascaux display not merely decorative patterns but detailed, naturalistic representations of animals and occasional human forms. These are narratives frozen in pigment, suggesting storytelling and possibly ritual significance. Similarly, Venus figurines carved from stone or ivory exhibit consistent stylistic features across wide geographical areas, indicating shared cultural concepts rather than individual whims. The technology of this period also shows advancement, with carefully crafted, standardized toolkits designed for specific purposes and evidence of raw materials being traded over impressive distances. The proliferation of symbolism during this era permeates daily life in ways not seen before. Objects become carriers of meaning beyond their practical function. Personal adornments like beads and pendants suggest identity markers or social status. Burial practices grow more elaborate, with grave goods that clearly indicate ritual intent rather than practical concerns. This widespread use of symbols points toward a cognitive threshold being crossed, a new fluidity in thought and communication that allowed ideas to be shared, refined, and preserved across generations. This cultural flowering represents the maturation of cognitive capacities that had been developing gradually over millennia. The occasional symbolic gestures of earlier periods, the careful burial, the marked object, the planned hunt, now coalesce into a consistent system of representation and meaning. Reflection becomes embedded in cultural practice, enabling the accumulation and transmission of knowledge in unprecedented ways. This shift does not necessarily indicate a biological revolution, but rather the culmination of a long developmental trajectory, where the potential for symbolic thought became the foundation for all subsequent human culture. The world being built was no longer just a physical landscape, but a conceptual one, shaped by shared ideas and collective understanding. The evidence we've examined suggests the humans that came before us were engaged in a gradual cognitive evolution. They felt grief, created early symbols, and planned complex hunts long before the cultural explosion of the Upper Paleolithic. The most meaningful distinction may not be biological but cognitive, the full emergence of the symbolic mind. This capacity to layer the world with shared meaning ultimately defined our species. If this perspective on our deep past resonates with you, we welcome your reflections in the comments.